There is always that chase scene through a crowded marketplace. In those scenes, tables get knocked over, people jump out of the way just at the last minute, things get destroyed, general mayhem takes over, chaos reigns supreme. It's what I would expect from a James Bond movie, but not from Jesus. Theologian N.T. Wright states that many popular depictions of Jesus portray him as a hippie peace child, a delicate flower of a man, a dew-eyed first century Jewish Gandhi. Why would anybody want to hurt him? Wright goes on to say, though, but we should be looking for a crucifiable Jesus, a Jesus who does something so radical that it makes the religious of the day murderously hostile. And that is exactly the Jesus we find in today's gospel. This is not a random event. It's not about the animals or the money changers being in the temple. Jesus knew that they would be there. It's not his first trip to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. He grew up as a faithful Jew, going to the temple. He didn't just show up on this day and say, "Whoa, I didn't know there was going to be animals and money changers here." The money changers and animals had always been there. That's how the system worked. It was business as usual for them, to be sure. But this act of Jesus was an act of disruption, and not just disrupting the events taking place in the temple that day, but an act of disruption that cut to the core of the historic Jewish faith. It was Jesus's way of saying the old way of practicing your faith was no longer appropriate. The heart of faith was being lost in rituals, and passion for God was being sold out. Jesus knew that true faith cannot ever be expressed in empty rituals. It's as true today as it was back then. Now, each gospel writer puts a little different spin on the story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, often referred to as the synoptic gospels because they include many of the same stories in a similar sequence or identical wording, place it during the final week of Jesus' ministry. But John records it right after Jesus' ministry begins. Jesus' action at the temple is often understood to be among the events that led to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. The Gospel of John places it much earlier in Jesus' public event. In John's Gospel, this event occurs at the very beginning, right after his first miracle at the wedding feast in Cana. Richard Neil Donovan suggests, as the precipitating incident for the crucifixion, the cleansing of the temple took place near the end of Jesus' ministry. This would also account for the abruptness of the transition from the Canaan wedding to the temple cleansing. It seems unlikely that Jesus would just come out of nowhere and cleanse the temple without stirring more significant opposition. The style of the synoptics is quite different from the Gospel of John. The synoptics emphasize more the history of Jesus' life, while John emphasizes more the theology behind his life. It would be more in character for John than the other three to move this story out of sequence, and it seems likely that he did so to establish important themes right from the onset of his gospel. We need to be careful when we read the Gospel of John. It tends to reflect a greater tension and animosity between Jesus and the Jewish authorities than the synoptics do. The Gospel of John was the last of the 4 Gospels to be written, and its narrative reflects the growing divide between Christian and Jewish communities. A greater emphasis on the distinction between Christianity and Judaism is found in John's Gospel. John explains to his audience, an early Christian community, that temple worship would no longer be necessary because it was surpassed in the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. With greater frequency than all the other evangelists, John intersperses post-resurrection reflections of this Christian community in his narrative. After clearing the temple of the merchants and money changers, John's gospel tells us that the people asked for a sign of Jesus' authority to do such an act. And in response, Jesus predicted his death and resurrection. Throughout John's gospel, the language of signs is distinctive. Jesus' miracles are called signs, and the people look to these signs for proof of his authority. John's gospel often employs the use of a double meaning, and that is what happens here, starting in verse 18, where we read, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" When Jesus answers, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," the Jews understood the temple to refer to the building where they were standing. But Jesus is actually talking about more than just a physical demolition and reconstruction of a temple. Jesus is talking about moving the meeting place of God and human beings away from a building. His own body will be the new temple, the place where the holiness of God dwells. All the things that the Jews were meant to find in the temple, life, love, healing, and forgiveness, from now on will flow through Jesus, through his broken and risen body, and they will flow for all people, not just the children of Israel. And that's what's important. Yes, our building is important. We have Rob and the wardens working hard to look after its structure and keep the roof over our head and the washrooms flushing. But our building, or any church building, loses its meaning and its reason for being without a loving, praying, growing, and outward-looking community meeting within its walls. Now, this sign had a bit of a delayed fulfillment. It didn't click with the disciples until after Jesus was raised. And how often do we see the meaning of an event in hindsight? We do not realize how God is working in our lives until sometimes years down the road. Jesus' actions in the temple were disruptive, but I'm glad that we belong to such a disruptive Lord. This disruptive Lord can overturn anything and everything that hinders us from an appropriate devotion and service to God and each other. There is a sacred place within each of us, a place where God is. We're called to live our lives from that sacred space of God and to love and respect the sacred space of God in others. Perhaps Lent is a good time to visit our inner sanctuary more often, spend more time listening to God's voice, and meditate on how we can be disruptive. Amen.